almost like she knew she was being videoed.
She's like, I want to be on video.
Woo,
All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that. Almost like she knew she was being videoed.
She's like, I want to be on video.
Woo,
All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila.
Right. Click on wading into Lilu and do it again. Something's wrong.
And then this one. I can just hand them to you after you get started.
The webcam's broke. The camera's broke. Let's see. 1 second, people. 1 second. All right, take two. Turns out the internet and live streaming isn't always easy. So my name is Brett. This is my live show that I do every week. And we talk about DevOps, Docker, Kubernetes, cloud, system infrastructure, sysadmin development, all that stuff. And I take your questions and we do, let's see, we do questions and then I talk about some stuff. And I'm already seeing some people asking some good questions in the chat. So that's good. So the way that works is we'll talk about some announcements. I'll talk about some stuff that has been happening this week. And then we will get to your questions. And we'll fill the hour with as many questions as possible. And if you don't get your question answered because there's so many of them, just make sure you hang out or leave the browser open and I will answer them in chat. So even if I can't answer them live over video stream, I will answer them in chat later. So make sure you stay on the page so that the chat still refreshes and works. And then I'll make sure that I at least get you something. And this week, one of the announcements is that we have a new puppy. His name is Whiskey, and he's not being very, he's being camera shy. So let me see if I can get him. All right, so this is Whiskey. He's probably going to like the mic. He is 8-week-old Vizsla, and the mic is very exciting to him. So I don't know if he's technically the new official mascot, but he might as well be. And there he goes. There he goes. And off he goes. So we've only had him 36 hours, so that's been fun. Not a whole lot of sleep. So you'll see more of him. I'll be shooting out or changing out the videos from the intro, and those will hopefully have more whiskey in them. His full name is Whiskey Charlie Star-Lord Fisher, but of course everybody wants him. He wants everyone to call him Star-Lord, but of course no one wants to call him Star-Lord, and that's sort of an inside joke if you know Guardians of the Galaxy. So this week, so there was some stuff that happened security-wise, some patches that needed to happen. So we'll definitely be talking about making sure that you get your Docker up to date. But first, I want to talk about my resources, my courses, and make sure that you know that all that stuff's there in case you're new to this show or this channel. The way to make sure you get updated on this channel live every week when I go live, rather, and get a notification when I go live streaming is to click subscribe below. And then there's a little bell, a little dinner bell looking thing. You click that, and then it will notify you whenever I go live, and you can just hop on. These live videos are now getting changed into a playlist afterwards. So even if you can't watch it live, you can watch it later. And then the best parts of this show, or maybe the best questions and answers that we come up with that would hopefully be helpful to other people, are now making their way into a series of clips that are going to be in the courses if you take my courses. Then some of those clips will make it onto YouTube, and then some of those clips are making it into a podcast. So let me change out the screen, and we'll get to the internet so I can show you some of that stuff and give you some links. All right. Here for the dogs. Absolutely. That's the only reason we have this show. In fact, I was doing a mic check earlier, and I was saying that this show only exists now for dogs. It's now a dog show that happens to be about DevOps. At some point, we just say the word DevOps, and we check off the "this is for work." So I want to talk about my Docker resources real quick. I have 2 courses for sale. These are the best coupons, brettfisher.com/Docker. On Docker and Swarm, the Node course, which is going to be all about using Docker with Node and how to get the best stuff if you're a Node.js fan, or if you're just doing projects that are maybe front-end projects that happen to use NPM or something on the back end. You'll definitely get some stuff out of there if you're doing more of a React style, maybe not so much a back-end or an API person. Anyway, so all that stuff is going to be in that course, and we are working through that course now. I actually just finished another section this week and starting another section today, actually. So we're recording furiously as long as the dog will behave. And we'll get that out. And then the next up is hopefully a Kubernetes course. I've been working on that for months, so I had no announcements on that course yet, but everyone obviously, you know, is asking about Kubernetes, and it's a very hot topic. Probably the #1 topic right now in container land. And I'm hoping to do something a little bit different with that course, where we sort of contrast and compare a little bit of the different orchestrators and the different ways you can deploy Kubernetes so that you can make the right choices, because Kubernetes isn't for everyone, Swarm isn't for everyone, Docker isn't for everyone. And it's important to understand as a part of your toolbox which tool is the right tool for the job. So I'm hoping to do a little bit of that rather than just show you features. And if you're familiar with my Swarm course, I also do that there as well. We talk about workflows, we talk about when to do things, when not to not do things. And I think that's just as important as understanding features and functionality. All right. The rest of the resources there are all free. You can now get my workshop videos and some of that stuff through my different feeds. There are some playlists on YouTube that show public videos from conferences I've done, including DockerCon. There's actually slides, thousands of slides from the 3 different workshops that I help with or deliver myself, including Docker and Swarm and Kubernetes there. So in case you're wanting slide material, it's all open source there. You can definitely go check that out. And then as you keep going down, there's everything from production Docker tips to blogs I prefer for recommended, configurations and stuff like that, tools for deploying your stuff on containers. And then we get down to specialized stuff like Windows containers, which is a increasingly hot topic over the last year as Windows has gotten better and better with its Windows container support. So a lot of stuff there now on Windows containers. I get a question probably every other day on Windows containers now, where just a year ago, it was probably a couple times a month. So definitely a huge increase in the interest of Windows containers there. lots of resources, and more will be coming, I'm sure, in future videos on that stuff. So this week, or within the last week, I should say, I launched a new podcast, and that is at brettfisher.com/podcast. So in the last week, it's now up on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Google Play, iTunes, all the places that you would normally expect to see a podcast. And the way this podcast is working is it's clips from this show. So it's not a recorded show exactly just for podcast. It's more like the audio only version of clips of this show that makes sense. So when you ask great questions, then your question and my answer will end up in that podcast. So if you're someone who doesn't have a chance often to watch these live shows and you maybe are looking for specific topics, definitely check that out. As you can see by the playlist, we'll go down here and go subscribe. I'm just going to jump on the Apple one. And you'll see I think I've got 8 or 9 episodes already. And each one is on a specific topic. For example, last week someone asked about Windows containers, and so I did a little segment on Windows containers and an update in Windows 10 on how you can now do process isolation, which is different than Hyper-V isolation. It's a little more, it's got some dependencies, but if you can do it, then it means fewer resources used for your containers. They don't have to spin up their own server OS. They can run natively on your Windows 10. So that's pretty great. And so each one of those can be short. Like some of those are even just 4 minutes long. So definitely check that out, subscribe, and basically just search for your favorite stuff. Maybe not all of these episodes are related to what you're working on, but as you ask great questions in this show, then I will get more and more answers into that podcast. All right, so this week, a security vulnerability was announced with runc, and it's a good time for us to talk about what is runc and how does it relate to Docker, Kubernetes, and all the things. So runc has been around, well, really for a long, long time, almost near the beginning, and it is a component that is a part of not just Docker, but multiple container runtimes. And it is the thing that runs your container. So if you actually went on a machine that you had Docker installed on, the daemon itself, a Linux machine, you would see when Dockerd launches a container, you'll see other things starting up like runc and containerd. And those two processes, runc and containerd, are the parts that are running the container itself. And Dockerd is sort of a management daemon that sits on top of all that just manages all the various containers and things running, right? If it's running Swarm, it's obviously managing the Swarm database, but it's keeping track of all the different containers. But each individual container is run through runc and containerd. So runc this week announced a vulnerability. Like all the other components in this space, it is an open source component that was listed in the CVE database, which I think we talked about 2 weeks ago. We talked about CVE scanning. And so it's not just Docker that's affected. Also LXC is vulnerable. And the patch was announced at the same time that the vulnerability was. Actually, I think it was like the vulnerability was announced at, an hour early, and then the patch was available an hour later. This week, I believe we're going to be seeing, I think it's next Monday or this coming Monday, is when we're going to start seeing actual code of how this vulnerability works, which means that we are not very far from people making exploits of this code. Now, in order for this to happen, it has to be something where the code, the bad player or the bad person that's going to do something to get this vulnerability and use it for bad purposes is going to have to run their bad code inside your container as root. So it's already something that's assuming that they have access into the container itself and can run as the root process. And then from there, they can effectively they can do some stuff through the Linux operating system to the runc binary and cause a problem. And that would then let them later have code execution rights where they could sort of run their own thing as root on the host and sort of break out of the container. So the interesting thing is there's a really great rundown of this on the Kubernetes blog and talks about what is runc, what does the vulnerability really do, what should you do about it. The short answer is, regardless of what you're running, you should just update to the latest runc. In most cases, if you're just running pure Docker, that means updating to 1809.2. and that was released this week. And if you're on some other platform that's maybe not Docker based, like Google Container Engine, and you can see it like all these different things here, they were actually a little vague about the Docker stuff because the Kubernetes blog didn't know specifically about whether your Docker desktop, the thing running on Mac and Windows, was vulnerable, and it turns out that is not. They were saying, however, it seems likely that it was vulnerable, but it actually turns out that it's not. The Docker team, which we, myself and the captains in the captains chat with them, were talking about it the other day, and it was mentioned that the way that your Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows works is that little VM, that little Linux kit VM that runs in the background, it's running in read-only. So there's actually no way for any files to be overwritten or to even written to disk. So even if some bad actor were able to get somehow into the containers on your local machine and run code in that container, they're not going to be able to take over the Linux kit VM. It's unfortunate that we don't have a lot of our servers running read-only, because then that would really have prevented this bug. So the recommendation really is to just make sure that you're getting the latest runc, and in most cases that either is updating the, like all your apt software, if you're installing things from apt-get, yum, apk, all the package managers, or if you're running pure Docker, just update the Docker daemon. I do not know whether old versions of Docker are getting updated. I doubt anything past. If you're running Enterprise Edition, you get longer support. So if you are running the free versions of Docker, you just have to update to 1809.2. If you're running some old free version, the Community Edition of Docker, you need to update to 1809. Sorry, 1809.2, not 1806. 1806 was the release last summer. That one may or may not get updated, but it's only probably going to get updated for enterprise customers, because the way that Docker works is if you want older releases, older stable releases to be updated past a certain date, I think it's 6 months, you need to pay for that support. So it'll be their enterprise customers that get the old versions. If you're running the open source stuff, you just basically got to make sure you're on the latest stable release. All right. So that came out. I'm going to send these links and some of that info into the chat. And hopefully you've already got a process for how to update your servers. And, in some cases you can estimate the risk of this and decide on your own team whether or not this is appropriate to rush out. Most big teams will look at a security vulnerability and label their own internal threat level, essentially, and that will help them decide how fast their teams need to react. For example, if you're in a case where all your containers are running read-only anyway, then maybe this isn't as huge a problem. Or maybe your containers are all running trusted code. So you do security scanning, and you all the code and all the images that you're running, including ones from Docker Hub, you actually pull down, scan, and sign yourself, and then those go into production, so that in production that every image is trusted code. If that's true for you, then this may be a lower vulnerability for you, because one of the things here is that it has to be running untrusted code in the root process of the container to even be a risk. So check that out, read that. It's really interesting stuff, even if you are not someone who's running Docker production, because I think learning a little bit about runc and how the underlying components of Docker work is an important thing. All right, so next up, some other news. I love talking about jobs and career stuff as well, because I've been doing this for a long, long time. So I always try to help everyone else out as much as I can. That's why I run these courses and do this live, right? So some interesting stuff came out. Of course, we are all fully aware that Kubernetes is popular. I think sometimes the hype is greater than the actual adoption. But what is not hype is the number of jobs that list it as a desired trait. Sometimes people say, these jobs all require Kubernetes, so these are Kubernetes jobs, and I'm not saying that that's what this is. It's hard to tell whether or not a job is truly a Kubernetes job, right? Because if you ever looked at a job requirements list, sometimes it can list a dozen different things, and really you could get hired if you just knew 2 or 3 of them. It's really sometimes in job postings listing tools that they would hope you'd know, and that would be sort of a bonus. And then there's maybe 1 or 2 that are really required knowledge. And so what this is actually a chart over the last 4 years, I believe, of on Hacker News in the job posting section, the number mentioning Kubernetes. So Hacker News is sort of the tip of the spear, I would say. Most job postings don't go to Hacker News, I think, still at this point, most traditional business jobs. This is maybe more of the startup space, maybe the leading edge science space, and any job recruiters that are sort of trendy and aware of what Hacker News is, because a lot of them won't. It's not really the thing that we all go looking to right off the bat for new jobs. So anyway, this is sort of a leading indicator, I think, of what we all need to know, and that's we need to know orchestrators. We need to know not just containers now. We are expected as maybe DevOps people, and I'm assuming that these are job postings for people related to DevOps, but that Kubernetes is definitely a thing, right? The next thing is on popular open source or languages support. So jobs related to software development languages. And of course, I've got a node.js course coming out. I'm a big fan of node.js, but I'm also a fan of Golang. And if you weren't aware, Golang, or just Go is made by Google, or was started by Google, and is now an huge open source project. And it is the language that Docker is written in, as well as Kubernetes and so many of the rest of the tools in the space. So if you are using any container tool, chances are that thing was written in Go. I believe Prometheus was written in Go. In fact, I think someone at some point said that everything interesting happening in the container space and in software development in general is happening with Go language. So if you're not familiar with the Go language, their website is over here at golang.org, Golang.org. And they have a nice little quick tutorial on Go. And a lot of people that develop it just absolutely love it. So people are moving to that language from other languages. Some famous people in the Node.js space have left JavaScript back-end programming to move to Go. And it's very fast, it's very efficient, and it was designed for modern development workflows. So it has cool things like it automatically can use GitHub repos as submodules and stuff like that. So it has some really interesting design since it's a fairly new language. I think it's a little over a decade old, but has really caught on the last 4 and 5 years. And it has its own set of conferences around the world, so definitely go check all that out. And the report here, we'll put this link as well in the chat. This report was looking at Dice, which Dice is a job hunting board, a recruiting board. I think I actually have got a job in the past from Dice way back early in my career, because it's been around forever, for decades. And one of the things that they saw was the highest paid jobs, and in terms of developer jobs and what tools they needed to know or what languages they needed to know to get the highest paying jobs. And Golang by far was the highest average paying job skill. So that's an interesting thing. If you're someone who's looking to move up the ranks in your pay or something like that, and you're already a developer and you're maybe using some other languages, you might consider Go as your next hobby project, and check that out. So that report's got some other cool stuff in there about job satisfaction and other details, so I will put that in there for you. And let's see. Oh, yeah, we already talked about the podcast. All right, so that's all the announcements I have this week. So now is the time for you to get your questions in. If you don't yet have your questions, and you're watching, basically any question around DevOps. Well, now we take questions on puppies, but we also do Docker, DevOps, cloud, server infrastructure, anything around that stuff. And we have the first question, which was in early before the show even started, is from Verificationer. Hello. The question here is, I have 2 containers in Docker, one for PHP and one for Nginx. I need the ability to restart the Nginx service from within the PHP container. How would I go about doing that? What are the common practices when a web application requires to run a command on another container? And then I ask for maybe some more details about why the PHP needs to restart a different container. And he says it has a way to do with multi-tenancy from within the application, which is a PHP container. It creates a configuration of Nginx on the fly, and for that it needs a restart for Nginx. So this is an interesting question, because what it really comes down to is we're talking about containers managing containers, right? Applications inside a container managing the infrastructure. And that's why all these tools, we're talking about Docker, Swarm, Kubernetes, all those tools have web APIs. And that's largely the way that you would manage these tools. So don't think so much of that you need to go in to the container itself from PHP and maybe somehow hop from PHP and talk to Nginx container directly. What you're really going to be doing is having your PHP container have access to the APIs that it needs in Docker. Or if you're using orchestration and you have a multi-server cluster, then what it's going to need to do is talk to the orchestrator, whether that's Swarm or Kubernetes. That's the design of these tools, is that you can operate them through APIs, right? So in your case, a couple of things you need to worry about and maybe check out. So the first thing is to concern yourself with security, right? You've got to ask this PHP app, if you're going to give it control of containers, it ideally is only going to be able to control the containers that it needs to. But that's not something you get out of the box with Docker. You're going to need to do some sort of authorization plugin that does scoping around controlling what, giving access to limited numbers of things in a limited scope, right? So that's least privilege concepts, where we want to make sure that your PHP container can only actually affect the Nginx one and not do whatever it wants to do. Now, if this is just an internal system or something that you're not terribly worried about security, sure, just have at it. Basically, you're going to give it an API endpoint, and one of the ways you could do that securely is if the simplest way is if it's just running on a single machine running Docker, is to give it access to the socket. So if we went into my dog versus cat repo, one of the examples here is traffic, and traffic is like Nginx. It is a reverse proxy, a front-end proxy, and a lot of these orchestration proxies get their commands from looking at the orchestrator itself and changing things based on the orchestrator. So one of the things you might consider is, and if you're not aware of it, is to look at some of these things like traffic. There's also another one called Docker Flow Proxy. There's lots of other tools like this that they operate at the orchestrator level, and they are themselves the front-end proxy, and they will change their own config based on what's happening in the backend. For example, if new containers spun up or new services spun up, or in Kubernetes, new deployments spun up, the front-end proxy could automatically route traffic to them by reconfiguring itself on the fly. Now, that stuff's all built into these tools. That may not fit your exact need, but let me just show you the example here of Stack Proxy. Let me zoom in a little bit. All right, so yeah. So right here, what you can see is this particular traffic container is running as a service in Swarm, and the way that it controls the Swarm and the multi-server containers. I have a dog. Hi, buddy. The way it manages all these containers is directly through the Docker socket, and then it can speak HTTP directly to that socket and doesn't need to open up a web API over a TCP port. So that's probably the safest way for you to do it. If you can run these PHP containers on a server that has management control either over that entire server, or if it's a multi-server cluster, let's say in Swarm, it's going to need to be on a Swarm manager. And then you won't need to open up TCP ports and worry about that. You can also do other things that reduce the scope without having to have a full authorization plugin solution. And I showed that example here in Proxy Global, where we use something. I think it's called Docker Socket. And Docker Socket here is an interesting little proxy, and it uses HA proxy in front of the Docker proxy itself, and then it limits, based on environment variables, what you can do through that endpoint. So it's an interesting way of getting around needing a full RBAC authentication plugin. And if you're not familiar with those, they're just full tools. Oh, puppy update. Are you wanting me to hold him?
No.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted him to say hi again.
Puppy in the shot. So you can check this one out. It's actually called let's see, Docker Socket Proxy. So I think there's a GitHub link. So this might be a way for you to secure it. Also, I'll send you traffic link. And So that's how you would go about it. At the end of the day, if none of those things work and you just need PHP to restart or change out a container, the way that I would do it is I would have it talk to the Docker socket, whether it's over TCP or the file-based socket. It would talk to the API of Docker, and then it would update that config file in, let's say in Swarm, you have configs. In Kubernetes, you have configs. So you would write that config to those values inside the orchestrator, and then you would have it change out the service running the Nginx container. So that's kind of the workflow you would have it do. You wouldn't necessarily have it rebuild an image and then redeploy that image. That sounds painful. What you wanted to do is change out any secrets or any configs, because those are storage variables that are kept inside the orchestrator. If you're not using an orchestrator and it's just a single server, then you could put that file, write it somewhere to the hard drive from the PHP container, write it out to a volume, and then have that volume mounted into the Nginx container and pull that file into itself by just having your PHP edit or manage the Docker API, right? So that's how you would do that. Hopefully that helps. That gives you some ideas to get you closer down the road. There's lots of ways for you to solve that problem. Hopefully that gets you closer to your solution, but it's a great question. Hello, Billy. I'm just in time for the dog videos. This is the main reason for tuning in. Absolutely, I agree. I am just the boring part of the show. The best part is the dogs. Pellin asked, what are your thoughts about the runc container breakup vulnerability that came out? So I definitely covered that topic at the beginning, but thanks for bringing that up. I'm glad that you're paying attention, and that's definitely an important thing for us to keep track of. It's not very often that vulnerabilities come out in these core Docker tools like runc, Docker daemon itself, and containerd, but when they do happen, we definitely all need to care, because it's kind of like a kernel bug, right? It's like we all are affected by it in some way, and we need to care about it. Billy's up next with, I posted a GitHub issue to your PHP Docker repo today saying I could never make it to view the stream live, and here I am. I thwarted myself. So, well, thanks for showing up, Billy. I'm glad that you could make it today, and I will check out your comments on the GitHub repo later. I will check that out for sure, Billy. I'm not sure if, Billy, if you're expecting, are you wanting me to look at that for the show? Let's see, handling production secrets, environments, and configs for multiple servers. So I'm wondering if you can shorten, that's a pretty long question for me to read. I wonder if you can shorten that, if you're still on the chat here, if you can shorten that into a couple of lines into the chat so that I can maybe talk about it in the show. If not, I'll come back to it at the end once we've answered everyone else's questions, and I'll give it a quick read and see if I can't help you. Let's see. Pun, I've been getting told a lot recently not to worry about getting the DB Postgres running in a Docker container, that it may be better to keep the DB on bare metal. Thoughts, especially with replication. Okay, so if you're running your DBs today on bare metal and they're working fine, then you got to ask yourself, are you containerizing for just because it seems cool, or are you containerizing for a specific reason to gain something you need, right? Databases are probably, they run great in containers. I should say that out the gate. Lots of containers are running databases. I run all my databases in containers when I have to. The option I prefer is to just use the cloud hosting of the databases themselves. In other words, if it's on AWS and I can use RDS for their own solution, I'd rather do that. I'd rather not have to run and maintain my own database servers, because most of us are not full-time DBAs. The cloud engineers that run the cloud tend to be better DBAs than we are. So I always prefer running my databases in cloud stuff, right? That being said, if this is just a personal project, or if you're not allowed to do that, or if you have very, very specific reasons not to, price should not be one of them, because I, in most cases, can clearly argue that it's going to be cheaper for you to host that on their storage in their environment, because you're going to get automatic redundancy, you're going to get better logging and monitoring out of it out of the gate, and otherwise you'd have to do all that yourself. And if you're going to do all that yourself, you're probably more expensive than the cloud storage itself. So just the hosting itself may be more expensive than a bare metal server, but you cost something to the organization, and you managing all this stuff yourself costs something. So I would much rather get my time back to work on other things that maybe the cloud doesn't do great for me. And one of the things they can do well is databases. So that being said, if you need to run your databases, a database in bare metal and a database on that same bare metal in a container will not be any difference in performance. There is, with the exception of a very few rare cases in the way that maybe your volumes work, and as long as you're properly storing your database logs and in volumes themselves, and assuming that that volume is on the same storage that you had in the bare metal case, because obviously storage I/O would change if you moved the file somewhere else, then everything will be the same. There is no layer of emulation or delay or some sort of shim in the middle of a container. It's bare metal. It's running on the host OS, right? So if that host OS and that host kernel are on bare metal, that it's going to get bare metal performance. And I can say this with confidence because I did this. In fact, over on my Docker resources page, if you search HPE, there's a white paper that I did a couple of years ago with Docker and Hewlett-Packard, HPE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, I think is what that stands for. And we did a MySQL performance across 3 different scenarios using databases, one database engine in a VM, and then multiple VMs on a single host, right? Which is the cloud model. Most people, that's the model they do, the traditional model. Or having a few VMs with many containers all running a separate MySQL instance. So that means fewer OSs, but the same number of overall MySQL engines. Or running that same number of MySQL engines on bare metal in containers without any virtualization, right? So we did 3 different models that were most likely the models that you would use as you move from traditional VMs to containers. And without a doubt, bare metal wins hands down. It wins in terms of performance. It wins in terms of management overhead because you only have 1 OS now instead of potentially 8 or more OSs, depending on how many MySQL VMs you create. It also saves you lots of space and memory resources because you don't have to run each OS and use, gigs of RAM just to run the operating systems over and over again, right? So if you think about efficiency, it was way better on bare metal. That's containers running in bare metal. If I had to run that database on bare metal without a container, then I probably wouldn't want to run multiple database engines on that same OS, right? So now if you're not using containers on bare metal, you must either, one, need all the resources of that one physical machine, right? So maybe it's a really large database, or you're just not able to fully utilize the resources of it because you're not able to stack up, 5 different MySQL instances all in the same bare metal. So that's the advantage I see in containers, is it allows you to discretely isolate separate database engines all in the same bare metal. And why not? Why not do that if you have access to bare metal and you're willing to do that? So I would not go running and putting Postgres into containers just because I thought it was cool. I would definitely come up with a list of pros and cons. And a pro is it's isolated. You can add more things to it, like more containers, and you don't have to worry about them conflicting with each other. But if your database is going to have dedicated hardware and it's not going to have any sharing of resources, then maybe the container isn't necessary. Maybe you can get away with that. Now, eventually, everything you have, once they're all in containers, you're going to wish that everything else was in containers too, right? You're going to have all your management tools looking for containers. So there's pros and cons there, right? I wouldn't just go running into the container land, but I certainly would not say that taking something from an OS and then putting it in a container on that OS, to me, doesn't usually change the performance at all. It's really the same process on the same OS. It's just has a security boundary around it now that limits its resource access potentially, and it limits its ability to do other things on the machine, right? All right. Hopefully that helps narrow down, but that's a great question about databases. And if you're interested more, definitely go check out. There's a couple of white papers there on my Docker page and at brettfisher.com/Docker. And you can read about bare metal performance versus VM performance for databases. All right. We have someone up next. Let's see who's next there. Let's see, John Kennedy. Is it possible, and if so, How can you run a container in read-only with Docker Compose? That's a good question. As far as I know, you can do it. Let's see. I would go looking at the Compose file documentation on Docker's website, and then I would just search for read-only. Nope, nope, nope. I'm not. World readable. Maybe it's a security option. Yeah, read only. Or is that for volumes? This is just for volumes. So you can set a volume read only. I'm going to keep checking here. So I'm not sure if you've actually done this, John, if you've gone through the documentation. Okay, so yeah, down here at the bottom, this is where it's at. So because Docker Run has a read-only option that you can throw in that will make the container itself, the file system, all read-only. And you, in a container in Compose, you can specify the read-only attribute as well as any of the other Docker Run security counterparts. So there's a lot of them here, and it's just listed down here at the bottom of the page. So you would do a read_only : true. And that would essentially make the whole container read-only. So there you go, John. Hopefully that helps and answers your question. Let's see who's next. Jeffrey, Docker newbie here. Could you comment on Docker Swarm versus Kubernetes? Is Kubernetes the preferred orchestration until now, or they fill different use cases? Hi, Jeffrey. That's a great question. It's asked very often on this podcast, as well as in my courses and generally anywhere I speak or everywhere. So it's a very common thing. I totally get why you're asking it. There's a lot of resources I can send you to that probably have more detailed answers on that. But the gist of it is Swarm and Kubernetes are two different ways to solve the same problem. And that just like there's other orchestrators like Mesos and Nomad, Swarm and Kubernetes are probably the two most popular right now, unless you're maybe in telecom where Mesosphere has sort of a higher exposure inside the telecom space. I would say when you're just learning Docker, there's a reason that with my Docker Mastery course, I teach Swarm out of the gate because it's built in the box. The concepts are very similar in terms of how you design a cluster, the multi-node aspects of a cluster, how you deploy a container service. You know, all that stuff is the same between Swarm and Kubernetes. So once you learn those concepts, the words will be a little different, you know, between the two of them, the terminology, but the concepts and the workflow are very similar. So you can learn Swarm very quickly. In fact, you could possibly learn it in a day if you just had a whole day to focus on it. My Swarm course is less than 8 hours of content, and it takes you through all the functionality. You can get, of course, those coupons over on my brettfisher.com/Docker page at the very top. Both of those courses are listed there. And I have a public AMA. So on GitHub, I have an Ask Me Anything in a repo, and I basically use the GitHub issues to allow people to ask questions that I can answer publicly. And Swarm versus Kubernetes, which is now over a year old as a question, has lots of comments in there, at least from me. It has more than a couple, because the game keeps changing, right? As Swarm and Kubernetes both add functionality, both have market exposure, things change, and the reasons which you would choose each are the same. But here's my short advice. Learn Swarm first. After you learn Docker, just make sure that you know Docker well, and that's what we do in my Docker Mastery course. You learn all the basic functionality of it, and then you learn the basic functionality of Swarm. Now, once you've learned that, if you want to hop to a Kubernetes course, I don't yet have anything like that yet. There are resources at Container Training for going through slides. And you can watch some videos from a friend of mine, Jerome, who does Kubernetes training. So on the Container Training page, you can actually probably find some videos. Yeah, so he has recorded workshops where he talks about Kubernetes. So you could take some of those resources. There's obviously lots of free resources on the internet and paid resources, other courses you can take. I like how Jerome does it because Jerome is extremely intelligent and is really good at communicating. He's actually one of the people that helped me build my Swarm workshops and Swarm course. He was teaching the Swarm workshop before I was, because Jerome was one of the original DevOps people at Docker before Docker, the company, even existed. So he's an original and is now doing full-time consulting and training on Kubernetes. So I would definitely check his stuff out. So after that, then you've learned a little bit about Kubernetes, you learn a little bit about Swarm, and then you can decide for yourself whether your projects need one or the other. In general, Swarm is easy to manage, but has a limited feature set. It doesn't solve every problem in every use case. Kubernetes is sort of the Swiss Army knife and can do lots of things, has lots and lots of repos of tools and ways to use it, but it's also harder to deploy and manage. So if you're a small team or just one individual, it can be really tough to roll your own Kubernetes. So that's why we're starting to see lots of cloud-based solutions, Amazon, Azure, even now DigitalOcean has their own way to deploy Kubernetes for you so that you don't have to manage that infrastructure. So Kubernetes is getting easier. So like if there's a spectrum, and Swarm was the easy button but limited functionality, and Kubernetes was a whole lot of functionality but hard to deploy and manage. They're slowly moving towards each other, right? Like Swarm is getting more features, and I expect to see more on that front this year as Docker announces new things. And Kubernetes is getting easier and easier to use. We're getting better deployment tools and better training. So yeah, there you go. I don't think that one size fits all in that regard. And a lot of shops, I think, are now, as they get more mature, and they learn both orchestrators, they're deploying both for specific use cases and choosing Swarm because it's easy when it works. And then if it doesn't do what they need, then they choose to do Kubernetes when they have to, that kind of stuff. So great question. There's other resources in this podcast. So if you search my channel here on YouTube and you search for the word Kubernetes, you might find some previous episodes that we talk about Kubernetes, and you can maybe listen to some of the opinions. I have a guest on, I think it was 3 weeks ago. We had a guest on that we talked about Kubernetes and Swarm, and you can also listen to that as well. All right. Good question, and I think that one is checked off. Palan says, what about the vulnerability that was put out about traffic's access to the Docker socket? I saw you comment on this thread. Let's see. What are we talking about here? I'm going to pull up this issue. Because I'm not sure what you're referring to. All right. Exposing Docker socket to traffic container is a secure. Yeah, so I vaguely remember this one. Let's see what I said. Yeah, okay, so this is originally, this is not a vulnerability. This is just the way things work. So whenever you're using a tool that needs access to control Docker or to control your orchestrator, you're going to need to give it some sort of access, right? Now, a lot of these tools out of the box, and this is totally normal, right? You have a multi-server orchestrator, you're usually going to need some of the tools, management tools, to control that infrastructure. And so I think this person that was reporting this, they're reporting as a bug, which it's not a bug. Different containers separate from traffic containers, as the latter typically expose the internet. So this is simply a question of design. And if you scroll all the way down to where I'm talking, we're talking about what the solution is. And I actually show off that solution here in this particular proxy global stack, where you're only giving traffic access to the parts of the Docker socket that it needs. And you're able to run different containers, one for the front-end proxy and then one container for talking directly to the socket. And what I think this person's concern is, and it's a valid concern, but there are ways to mitigate it, do I really want a container that is in the front, accessed from the internet, from my clients, and from potentially unknown individuals? should that container really have full access to the Docker socket? Now, in a perfect world, no, it should not, and none of your container tools should. But in some cases, they need some level of access somehow, right? So a front-end proxy typically needs to know about all the things in your infrastructure in order to set up its proxy to do that. So what we came up with in the community was a way to limit that risk and exposure through these different levels of the container. So essentially, if that link that I just sent you is my Swarm stack config that doesn't have the front-end proxy. That container directly does not talk to the API itself. It talks to a HA proxy in the middle that filters out things that don't need to be accessed. Of course, if your front-end proxy were to somehow get exposed, right? If it were somehow to be vulnerable to some unknown bug and someone comes in and completely has access to everything in that container, well, that container has access to a socket that controls Docker, even if it's just a little bit of Docker. So I'm sure they could do some damage, right? So maybe one of the things we can look at to even improve this is considering running that traffic container read-only. I'm not really sure if that would work or not, but that's some of the things you can do. That way you can prevent any nefarious potential attackers from writing things to disk inside the containers. But there's always ways to improve it, and this is all open source. So the ways that these things get improved is via the community figuring out ways to improve it, right? So that's what I'm doing. That's what others are doing. It's not a reason not to run traffic because lots and lots of people are running traffic in production. It's just something that you need to be fully aware of and understand and start to mitigate through techniques like what I'm using here. So that's a great question, a great concern. And I think for me, it's never perfect. There's always a pursuit to increase the security in this stuff. And but fundamentally, the way that these proxies are all working nowadays is they have some level of access to your container infrastructure because they're literally looking at it and reconfiguring themselves based on that. So in our case, it's read-only. So I don't believe there's a whole lot of risk in what I'm doing because it's giving read-only access to the API because the traffic container doesn't need to relaunch other containers. So I consider read-only access to limited parts from the front-end proxy a pretty good compromise in terms of security there. So hope that helps. That's a great question, though. Thank you. Verificationer is back. What is your opinion on the usage of Supervisor D? So that's a great question. Supervisor D, I'm assuming what you're referring to is putting Supervisor in the container and running it as the PID1 or the root process, right, in that container. That is fine if you need to do it, right? I know Docker's best practices are never more than one app per container. And I like to sort of take that idea and say it's really never more than one concern per container. And when in some cases that concern might be multiple executables, and so you would need to start of those with something else. And it could be some sort of fancy shell scripting. I like using Supervisor D. In fact, if you look at my PHP repo, I do that. I have a horribly outdated PHP repo for Laravel, so it definitely needs some updates to use some of the modern new Docker features, but it shows off a couple of things that are unique, and one of those is that for PHP, when you're using FPM, you need the PHP executable running and the Nginx executable running. And you could run those in separate containers, and that would probably be the official Docker way to do it if you were following their guidelines. But their guidelines are just that. They're just like best practices. They're the place to start, but it doesn't mean you have to stay there if you know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So in my case, I would, in this particular example, I combine both Nginx and the PHP FPM into the same container image, and I run them both with Supervisor D. And so it adds another layer of complexity because now I have Docker running a container that's actually running Supervisor, and Supervisor's running Nginx and FPM. But I find that it works well, and I've run this on very large global websites that are running in lots of regions in AWS. So this design is definitely time-tested and is used in heavy scenarios. The reason I like this is because Docker and Swarm out of the box don't have the concept of a pod. If you're in Kubernetes world, you have a pod concept, and in that case, you could run the Nginx and the PHP side by side in their own containers inside the same pod, And that pod is deployed together. So when it's deployed onto a server, you would know that you'd get both, and that they would both be able to use the sockets. If you're familiar with this stuff in PHP, they use the sockets to talk back and forth. And that's very efficient. But in the Docker Swarm way, you would do it out of the box that way. You would have to talk over TCP, and that adds lots of lag. I mean, not lots of lag. It's maybe fine for some people. But when you're talking about going across server instead of just talking over a local socket inside the same kernel, there's definitely added, possibly multiple milliseconds, if not tens of milliseconds of delay there. So I like to run them both in the same container, and I use Supervisor D to do that. So check out that example. I will throw that in chat. I think I saw someone post that in there already. So hopefully that helps you out and that answers your question. There's only a few places, by the way, that I use Supervisor D, and that's one of them. The other one might be like Cold Fusion, because it also needs like Apache or something on the front end in order to work, or Nginx. So anytime you have something where you've got a back-end binary that has to run to run your code, and then you need some sort of web server in front of it, and they have to both work together to deliver the service, because they're always going to be deployed together, and one doesn't work without the other, it makes complete sense that they go together in that case in the same image, especially when you scale them, if you're always going to scale them one for one, because a lot of things with containers, you would want to scale differently, right? You're going to scale the number of APIs different than you're going to scale the number of database containers. So in those cases, you definitely want the flexibility, and you want to be able to update them on separately. In this case, I'm just going to update the app at the same time, and I'm always going to replace the containers at the same time. So it makes a lot of sense to do those together. So hopefully that helps. Hello, Billy. Jordan asks, what's your thoughts on mixing Docker CE Ubuntu and Docker Enterprise Windows Server in the same swarm? Perfect. Totally do it. There's no reason not to. The swarm functionality in both of them is the same. So with your Windows Server, I would say make sure, in order to get all the functionality that you want out of the box with Swarm, definitely use at least Windows Server 2019 if you're going with official releases, or if you're doing the semi-annual releases, use 18.09. So these are the latest versions of Windows Server, because that's going to get you the most functionality and support out of Swarm. If you follow back in time, the Docker Engine and Swarm on Windows have not always had all of the networking and front-end routing support in the networking stack, because Windows just couldn't do it. And over the last couple of years, each version of Windows, we started with Server 2016, and then version 1709, then 1803. These versions of Windows Server that came out started to add more and more functionality, to where finally in the 1809 release and in the Windows Server 2019 release, those now are as far as I know, feature complete across Linux and Windows. So it's not that the old ones won't work. They'll work fine in the Swarm. They just won't have, for example, an older version like Server 2016 wouldn't work with your routing mesh. So if you're using overlay networks with routing mesh, it would not work, right? Anyway, those are the only few reasons I would worry, but it doesn't really have anything to do with Linux and Windows together. It really just has to do with Windows support, right? But yeah, they work great in the same Swarm, and I recommend it. In fact, I think even in Docker Enterprise, you have to use both, even if you're using all enterprise versions, because Swarm, like all of the Docker Enterprise stuff, doesn't run on Windows yet, I don't think. So your manager nodes still have to run on Linux. So yeah, not a problem. Although I would say that if you're running, oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying Docker CE on Ubuntu with Docker Enterprise Windows Server, but you're not talking about Docker Enterprise. You're talking about I was thinking you were talking about UCP and DTR. Those are the paid products. I think you're referring to just the Docker engine being Docker Enterprise inside of Windows Server, because Windows Server comes with the paid version of Docker. So yeah, that's totally fine. Totally fine. I would do it. Just like I said, make sure you're on the latest version of Windows. Hopefully that helps. All right. So up next, we got Billy. I just added a short edited version. I was being verbose when it was just a GitHub issue. Was that the question I already answered? Oh, oh, short edited version in your post. Let me go back over to that. Where did I put that? The short version of this question is we seem to have a bit of a mix of using environment variables, secrets, config files, and some in Swarm, some in CI. Is there a nicer accepted way of storing these and getting them into running containers? Things like console, vault seem to be adding even more complexity. No, there is no magic button for all of that stuff. I think that at some level with your CI, you're going to have a mix of environment variables, config files, and secrets in any orchestration. And if you're trying to do full CI/CD, that I would say is probably normal. You're going to have configs and secrets that are fed from environment variables in your CI, and your CI is probably, I'm guessing, the one that's deploying those things for you. Let me scan the rest of your question real quick. So yes, basically your question is talking about just the messiness of CI and the fact that different applications want their secrets and their environment variables in different ways. And correct, there is no universal, right? So in general, I would be feeding all of my stuff into secrets and configs as much as possible, but not everything can read from a file. So my goal is to standardize all of my config and secrets and then have maybe an entry point script that takes those for sort of legacy apps that don't read the files and take those scripts, or sorry, those configs and secrets and uses a script to turn them into the environment variables if they're needed for that particular app. If that app is maybe a PHP app and it expects a .env file, then I'm going to have my configs and secrets bump into that. In other words, they're going to replace that .env on startup because I'm going to have the config mapped. By the way, you can have configs that depend on secrets now. So if you do some Googling around, you can basically create templates where in your stack files, when you're deploying configs, they can pull from secrets. And in case you have configs that need secrets in them, right? So like a .env file or some sort of JSON file or YAML that an app needs, but a part of that file is a little value that is secret, and you didn't want to store that secret in a config because that would be unencrypted. You can technically now do that. You can have configs depend on secrets. So just look that up. That stuff exists. Another thing that you can do is template as much as you can of your configs and secrets so that you can use template variables inside those YAML files, and they can pull from environment variables in your CI. If you add Vault and other options, those are not options that will make all this easier, in my opinion. Those are options that basically take your secrets and store them outside of your Swarm, right? So if you have more infrastructure than just Docker or Swarm, those things will work to solve the rest of the problem, right? So if you have other infrastructure that needs secrets, and if you need console for other types of service discovery or config storage or something, yeah, so those aren't going to solve anything that or make anything inside of Docker easier. They're just going to be additive. So I wouldn't necessarily look at those to make Swarm easier. I would look at those if you have needs of outside of a Swarm, right? I guess the easiest scenario is if the only thing you're deploying is Swarm, then the only thing you have to worry about is getting stuff into those configs and secrets. A couple of weeks ago, and this answer, by the way, is also on my podcast, make sure that you're aware of the name attribute inside of your stack files for configs and secrets so that when you rotate them, you can just change out the name, and you can even change out that name with a environment variable so that when you're redeploying your stacks, you don't get that problem of it erroring out saying that your secrets and configs already exist. That's actually a video here on this channel as well as in my podcast. I talk a little bit about that. But hopefully that gets you a little bit closer. I don't have a magic button. I think it's really just working through the problem, continuing to study the functionality and features of the stack files themselves. So, jumping on the Docker website and researching more and more of the things inside of the compose file, especially going all the way to the bottom. And down here under extension fields, variable substitution, these are all what I would call sort of advanced compose concepts that will help you simplify and reduce the number of files you need and steps in the workflow as you learn some of the more advanced stuff in compose. So hopefully that will help you as you get into production. But yeah, that's the job of a DevOps person, right? Is to deal with all of those different steps in the process and to make them as simple as possible. Maybe sometimes you call them a build engineer. All right, great question. We have time for a few more questions. Let's see. Could you give an overview of how to set up Mongo in a swarm? It is as easy as setting the replica number to 3 or something else needs to set up. Right, so you can't just do that, right? You can't just, an orchestrator doesn't help you solve your database replication problem. You're going to need some more automation to do that. And that's a great question on Mongo because there is something on the internet called the autopilot pattern. So if I just searched autopilot Mongo, then you're probably going to come up with a couple of configs, for example, this repo, that essentially gives you some entry point scripts and automation that will help set this up in containers. I think there's a compose file in here. So you can use the compose file here to turn into your stack file, essentially, and it's going to use probably startup scripts and stuff like that to help figure out how to deploy your Mongo database. Oops. I don't know why it's saying error. Anyway, for some reason it said error. So yeah, check that out. And yeah, just search autopilot pattern and then whatever, MongoDB, MySQL, whatever you have. And it's usually for database technologies because all of the database technologies up until the last few years weren't designed for container orchestration. So they weren't designed to self-create their array or their replica or their mirror or whatever you want to call it, their backup read-only version or their, in Mongo it's replicas, and that doesn't happen out of the box. And there are some projects out there that are trying to solve this, where they're building out tooling inside of the database technology itself to sort of have things self-discover each other on a network and then sort of self-swarm. But that is not a feature of orchestration. Orchestration does not help automate your various database technologies into whatever design you want them to be, right? That's something you have to provide extra. And so the autopilot pattern, which was created by Joyent, that was actually an idea from them. If you just went to autopilot pattern, was it .io? Autopilotpattern.io. And they talk about what this means and why you would want to do this. And it just talks about basically having self-creating and self-healing infrastructure for database and static or persistent data technologies, rather. So let's see. What's next? Hi, Brett. Do you have any suggestions on running some cron job-like tasks on a swarm setup? Well, it depends on what you're going to need to do. This question has been asked a few times before. I'm trying to think if I ask it inside of my AMA, if it's talked about in the AMA. Let's see here. Let me search this real quick, see if I can't get you the cron. There's a pretty good trying to think this one. Yeah, this is a post I have here on cron stuff in. I don't know why I'm going to refresh this real quick. Let's pop out the chat, see if I can't. All right, so I put that AMA issue in there, issue 21. There's also, I believe, a... let me find here under my bookmarks. I have a pretty good one. There's a list of all the common stuff, and I think I thought I had feature request. Okay, this is what I'm looking for. Boom. So this Moby issue, this is actually a Docker issue in the Docker GitHub repo. This one has a whole lot of people talking about the issue of cron and batch jobs, and there's lots of discussion. If you scroll to the bottom, you'll start to see examples of people that have various tools. So there's at least, I don't know, 3 or 4 tools that you can run as containers on top of Swarm that will act like a cron manager for a container setup like that. So definitely check that out. All right, let's see who's next. All right, we have time for 2 more questions, and then if anyone else doesn't get their questions answered, I'll answer your questions inside of the chat afterwards. So definitely stay on the chat, and I will get you the stuff you need. All right. What is the point of having TTY true? TTY true. I'm assuming you're talking about in Docker Compose or in Docker Run. TTY gives you basically the ability to shell into that container. Some apps also expect a TTY interface, and they expect like the monitor, like an old KVM monitor experience. And so that will give the container that additional ability so that certain applications that are maybe running in the foreground need to have that. So yeah, I would say probably just Google that on Compose, and you'll probably see some examples of people that need to use it in certain containers that need to have it in order to work right. Let's see. Devag says, I tried PHP, it doesn't work. PHP Docker good defaults. Correct. PHP Docker good defaults is a work in progress, which means it's not finished. And it is definitely not something that you can just download and run. It is meant as a template for you to look at for examples of ways to solve problems. So unlike maybe some other ones that are a little more mature, like my Node.js one, the PHP one was started, and I just unfortunately don't have time to support every one of my options, but every one of my repos, and I haven't really received a lot of good pull requests from the community on that, unlike the Node.js one where I get a lot of support from the members of the community. The PHP one has not really it's had some discussion, but no one that's really helped me out with it, and I just haven't been able to find the time to give it a full treatment so that you can just run it out of the box, right? The other problem with PHP is that there is no running out of the box experience with PHP like you would have with Go or Node.js. PHP is incredibly unique to the project. Even just in the Laravel space, there's going to be a lot of differences based on your requirements for what PHP needs. An example there is that with like Node.js, if I have dependencies, 9 times out of 10, I install those dependencies with one line. I just do npm install, and I get everything I usually need, right? With PHP, a lot of times you also need to do apt-gets, and ahead of that, you might need to do some other things like language files or other manipulation. So when you look inside of my PHP repo, I'm not sure if I have that one still up. In the PHP repo, I basically pasted in some of the generic stuff I did on a PHP project for a large customer, and sort of leave it up to you to pull out the examples and how to use them. For example, they use a base image. We call these intermediate images, where they put all of their standards inside of a single Docker file, and then they use that Docker file to create their future Docker files. So that you actually see, for example, this Docker file here for the PHP repo. It's pulling from an image that you would have to create from the other base image, right? So a lot of this documentation isn't complete just because I haven't had the chance to go in there, but there's definitely some good examples about, especially for this one, how to combine Nginx and PHP FPM into the same image. That was one of the main things I wanted to get across with this example, was that how you could do that. And you could see the supervisor D here. You could use supervisor D config to set up a way to run, you see here, multiple apps. So I'm running PHP FPM and I'm running Nginx. Both of these are running in the same container at the same time, and system D, or supervisor D rather, is controlling those. So those are a couple of the things that I wanted to get across with this one. I apologize if the README isn't fully fleshed out yet. That's just not something that I've been able to get to because I'm too busy making videos for courses. But thanks for your feedback on that. Could you please share with us the latest development in containers and cloud world? That's exactly what this show is. I did that. That at the beginning of the show, I spend the first 5 to 15 minutes talking about a couple of things that are going on in at least my community and things. So this week we covered the security bug fix in runc. We covered job topics, stuff like that. And you can go to all my back episodes of this podcast or this, whatever you call this, the YouTube live show, and you can check that stuff out. And so one last question. Verificationer says, how is Whiskey doing? Unfortunately, Whiskey is not in the room, so I can't tell you that, but I'll have him more on the show in the coming weeks. And the last question you have here is that I'm at the point of making a decision whether or not I want to use a single node swarm or just use Docker with Compose and don't worry about Swarm for now. That's a great question, and I have an answer for that on my AMA. So over on my AMA, I think it's one of my top posts. Is should I use Swarm or should I use Compose? My opinion is always use Swarm. If it's a production machine, it should always use Swarm. And I list all of the reasons why a single node Swarm is better than Compose. The main reason is that you can't do rolling updates without downtime with Compose. You would have to bring them all down, change out the images, and then bring up new containers, right? Because Compose Compose was never designed, Docker Compose, the command line, was never designed for production use. It was never designed for the concepts of always uptime or multi-servers or anything like that, right? It doesn't have a database running in the background that collects information and stores decisions it's making around orchestration. So that's why a single node Swarm is the right way to go. And I list a bunch of reasons there. You can definitely check those out. For the rest of you, Billy and the rest of the list here, Jordan, I see their questions and I will answer those after we exit this live show. And so stay on the page to see those. If you're just coming in here midstream, I do this every week, so definitely subscribe to this channel and click the button to know when I go live. There are now live videos from this show, little clips that I make that are going live almost every day of the week. So check back often because another video was just uploaded yesterday. And I basically take the best parts of these shows each week so that if you missed the show, you don't have to watch the whole show. You can just look for the clips and see what you want to, if you're interested in those topics. And of course, for the rest of my Docker resources, go to brettfisher.com/Docker, and you can get my course coupons, all of my social links, as well as all my free resources and links to my friends and other great projects in the community. And so thanks so much for showing up and watching, and I'll see you next week on YouTube Live.